Every analyst who picked Cyril Gane before the fight is walking around with a quiet sense of vindication right now, and every analyst who picked Alex Pereira is going back through their reasoning trying to figure out exactly where the projection diverged from reality. The answer is sitting in the footage. Gane schooled Pereira. That is not a generous description, and it is not hyperbole. The jab found Pereira early and found him cleanly. The movement that Gane used throughout the fight denied Pereira the center of the cage and the platform from which his left hook and calf kick combination has dismantled every previous opponent. And when the finish came in the second round, Pereira had taken enough damage that the stoppage, however late some observers felt it was simply confirming what the fight had already established. Gane is the interim heavyweight champion. Pereira is going to the hospital. And the conversation that was happening before the fight about whether the analytical community had correctly assessed this matchup is now resolved by the only evidence that matters. Let's go back through the pre-fight analysis from the people who got it right, because understanding why they got it right is the most useful thing we can extract from the result. Tom Aspinall, who knows exactly what it feels like to share an octagon with Gane and who understood the stylistic problem Gane presents for a specific kind of fighter, identified the core issue clearly before the fight. Alex Pereira's knockouts at middleweight and light heavyweight came against men who were smaller than him, whose punch distance was limited, and who did not have the kind of power delivery that natural heavyweights possess. Pereira's size advantage at 185 and 205 was a significant factor in his finishing ability. Against Gane, who walked out to the cage at a weight within a few pounds of Pereira's own 251-pound check-in, that size advantage was gone. Gane did not flinch from the early pressure the way fighters at lower weight classes have. And Aspinall's second observation, that Gane's footwork, size, and range management were specifically problematic for a fighter whose offensive system relies on cutting off the cage and establishing the close-range exchanges where his power is most effective, proved accurate in real time. The pre-fight commentary from multiple analysts had identified the calf kick as Pereira's best path to disrupting Gane's movement. The theory was sound. You cannot maintain elite footwork if the lead leg has been repeatedly damaged, and Pereira's calf kick against lighter, less mobile opponents had been one of the most effective tools in the sport. Against Gane, executing the calf kick requires first solving the distance management problem. Gane has to be in a position where the kick can find the lead leg, which means he has to be slowed down or brought to a stop. Gane's corner strategy, as Gane himself described it post-fight, was specifically designed around this. Make pressure, keep the center of the cage, do not let Pereira do it to you. Deny Pereira the platform, deny him the stance, deny him the position from which the calf kick becomes a weapon. The strategy worked. The calf kicks that have slowed down and eventually trapped every previous opponent did not find the same consistency against Gane's movement. And without the calf kick landing with that regularity, the left hook setup that follows it could not be established. Henry Cejudo's pre-fight skepticism, which included the observation that Pereira does get hit, that he absorbs shots during exchanges, and that the question was whether he could absorb heavyweight-level power the same way he had absorbed shots at 185 and 205, proved prescient. The jab that Gane found early in the fight, according to the post-fight analysis that is now circulating, was essentially what triggered the sequence that led to the finish. Pereira has never been known as a particularly evasive fighter. His system involves accepting contact on the way to delivering contact, trusting that his power is the great equalizer and that any exchange he survives is an exchange he can turn in his favor. At middleweight and light heavyweight, the math on that system has generally worked in his favor. At heavyweight, against a jab that has the weight of a natural 250-pound man behind it, the math shifted. Sean Brady identified what he described as the path to victory for Pereira being essentially singular. He had to knock Gane out. The movement, the size, the refined striking, the range control, all of those factors favored Gane. Pereira's only real equalizer was power, and the question Brady raised was whether Pereira's hands would still be as fast, whether his footwork would still allow him to cut off a man this size, whether his cardio bank would support 5 rounds of the kind of sustained offensive pressure his system requires when the opponent is not a smaller man who can be caught and cornered more easily. The answer the fight provided is that the power was there. The jab that Gane used was not a one-sided affair, and Pereira landed shots that moved Gane, but the overall execution of the system that has made Pereira a 2-division champion could not overcome the specific physical and technical package that Gane brought to this fight. Francis Ngannou's perspective, shared through Eric Nixick, was particularly interesting given that Ngannou has trained with Gane and knows what the experience of exchanging with him actually feels like. Ngannou leaned toward Gane based on the movement and size advantage, and noted specifically that the takedown would not be a credible threat for Pereira. That assessment proved correct. Pereira did not significantly threaten with the wrestling dimension of the fight, and Gane's ability to maintain his preferred range without being pinned against the cage or taken down was central to his success. Kamaru Usman's pre-fight position was the most balanced of the major voices, acknowledging Gane as a serious challenge while refusing to count out Pereira, specifically referencing the pattern of people underestimating Pereira before his light heavyweight run and being proven wrong. Usman was not wrong to make that argument. The precedent for Pereira defying structural disadvantage exists. But the light heavyweight precedent was built on Pereira being the biggest, most physically imposing man in those fights. The heavyweight version of that precedent required him to perform at a comparable level when he was no longer the biggest man. The fight demonstrated the limits of the comparison. What comes next for each man is the question that the post-fight period now organizes around. For Gane, the path is clear. Tom Aspinall for the unification fight in Paris in September, a fight that Dana White confirmed he would try to make happen and that he called big. Gane called it out at the press conference. Aspinall has been waiting for it since his injury removed him from active competition, and the commercial case for doing it in France in front of a passionate French fanbase is sound. This is also the fight that will tell us definitively which version of Gane, the one who showed up against Jones or the one who showed up against Aspinall and now against Pereira, has become the permanent one. Against Aspinall, the movement advantage Gane used against Pereira becomes less available. Aspinall's wrestling and pressure-based system is designed specifically to deny opponents the kind of space Gane uses. The rematch will be the real heavyweight championship test. For Pereira, the situation is more complicated and more personally uncertain than anything he has faced in his UFC career. His post-fight statement about not being sure whether he will remain at heavyweight is the most significant thing he said after the fight, because it acknowledges openly that the experiment may not have produced the result that justifies continuing it at this level. The weight question, specifically the observation from multiple sources that 251 pounds may have been too heavy, that the heavyweight mentality of simply being bigger may have worked against the attributes of speed and explosive timing that have been the foundation of his entire competitive identity, is going to be central to whatever conversation he has with his team. If he returns to light heavyweight, where he was the biggest and most powerful man in the division and where his system produced multiple championship reigns, the Aspinall unification conversation is gone, but the legacy conversation remains intact. If he stays at heavyweight and addresses the issues the Gane fight revealed, primarily the movement solution that denied his offensive system its platform, he could become a legitimate heavyweight contender with the right adjustments. The broader context for this result is what it means for the legacy argument. Pereira going for a third belt, the first man to do it in UFC history, failing on the first attempt is not the same as it being impossible. He was always the smaller man in this fight. He was always working against the structural disadvantage of natural size. The finish came in the second round, which means the fight did not go long enough for some of the advantages his base camp believed would emerge in the later rounds to materialize. A different version of this fight, one where Pereira is more conservative in the opening exchanges, one where the calf kick landing creates earlier movement disruption, produces a different result at the margin. Whether that version of the fight exists as a real possibility in a rematch is the question Pereira and his team are now asking. The cheating conversation around the finish has not resolved, and it is part of the complete picture of this result. Multiple observers raised questions about whether shots to the back of Pereira's head in the finish sequence were illegal. The footage has been studied. The MMA community is not in consensus, which means the question of whether the finish was entirely clean remains open in a way that complicates the straightforwardness of a result that was otherwise analytically predictable. Here is what the Gane versus Pereira fight ultimately confirmed. The people who identified the movement, size, and range management advantages as decisive were right. The people who identified Pereira's power and finishing ability as the great equalizer were right about the tool, but wrong about whether the tool could be deployed effectively against this specific opponent. And the people who said there are levels to this sport, that moving up in weight and facing a natural heavyweight of Gane's caliber was a different challenge than anything Pereira had faced before, they were the most right of all. Gane is interim heavyweight champion. The unification with Aspinall is the next destination. And Alex Pereira is having the most difficult conversation of his UFC career, deciding what the loss means and where the next chapter begins.